All right, at this time, we will call this workshop to order. And Val, please call the roll.
Commissioner Penny,
Here.
Commissioner Curry, Commissioner Danio,
Here.
Commissioner Johnson, Mayor Villa.
Here. And tonight, we'll just jump right into the workshop. We have invocation and pledge of allegiance for our regular scheduled meeting at 6 o'clock. So we'll jump into it. This is the RV zoning criteria discussion that we wanted to have a workshop about. So I'll toss it right over to Mr. Forte if you want to kick it off.
We're going to probably really triple team this discussion. This has to do with the commission's desire to want to have an RV park in the city. We're talking specifically of the Bishop's property for a potential project, but it could be applied to other locations in the city. So there are a lot of things that we don't know, which is why we've got Scott here, who looked up some of the information, and Brian this past week. And we interpreted the code, the state law one way, and then we've got Mark Doust here. Mark is an engineer. Known Mark for quite a long time, actually. And I think Mark is working on a couple of RV parks. He's doing some design work for that. So my initial understanding was that once we go through a rezoning process and create a land use designation for an RV park, we're kind of out of the regulatory aspect of it in terms of the number of the density, the spacing, and things like that. And I'm not sure if I completely understand it, which is part of why we're having this work session. So I'm actually going to have Brian kind of stand up and start the process with what it takes for us to go from not having an RV designation to creating that RV designation. You know, what it would take, the time frame.
All right. Oh, yep.
What's the difference between us developing an RV use and a PUD?
PUD is very regulatory, and that's right. I don't know if we have the ability to regulate it.
Okay,
like
so once
that.
we create it, you're not certain we can regulate it.
Right.
Okay.
Because of the state? Okay.
Because its regulatory authority is the health department in the state.
Okay. All right, Mr. Walker, if you want to
Sorry,
come
Brian.
forward.
Basically, as Mr. Forte was saying, at this point, we don't have a zoning category per se for recreational vehicle parks. We do have a zoning category for mobile home parks. That's our R9 zoning category. And in that category, you can have mobile homes, you can have manufactured homes. As far as a recreational vehicle park, we don't have one. So we would have to, in a sense, create that category. It's something that possibly could piggyback on mobile home categories. It would be a text amendment to our land development regulations, meaning that we would create an ordinance which would have language that would permit recreational vehicle activity within a certain area. In addition to that, there would be something that would need to be done in terms of creating a future land use designation in our comprehensive plan that would allow recreational vehicles. And that perhaps is the most important thing, because any zoning category that we have has to really piggyback on a comprehensive plan or a future land use amendment that would allow the zoning. So first would come the comprehensive plan amendment to create a future land use that allows recreational vehicles, and then the zoning designation would come from that. It's not something that we have, so it would be something that would take some research in being able to put it together in a way that we would have as few unintended consequences as possible. But I think that it's something that could probably be done within a few months. What would go in there, I'm not really sure in terms of what we would put in the zoning category, because most of the things related to zoning are regulations, setbacks. Density would be something that the comprehensive plan would address, but there's some questions as to whether or not we have the authority to set those guidelines.
Wow. Mr. Forte, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm going to kind of let Scott give you an update based on what he did the research on, and then after that, we'll go to Mark and get Mark's input, and I think it's going to be a learning experience, certainly for me.
Okay.
And we'll see what we
Mr.
can
Simpson?
conclude out of it.
Yeah,
If you could speak in your mic, though.
oh, I'm sorry. Be stretching, man, to reach that. After we had a discussion, the commission talked briefly about, and I don't know if it was the last meeting we had, I can't remember, about the RV park. I thought, Brian and I spoke about viewing this almost, in the light of the Marina Grande project. And that when Marina Grande came here, we did not have the land use or zoning to accommodate that. So I remember having a presentation, the developers were here, presented the commission with what they were looking at and are wanting, and the commission liked the idea, said move forward, put together all the regulations so that we can consider this project. This is somewhat similar when Brian and I were talking, because we didn't, my understanding talking with Brian, we didn't have, and as Brian just said, the regulations that would contemplate this type of development. So we talked, and I did some research just trying to figure out what city would be the city to look at the regulations for. So I started Googling cities with the most RV parks in Florida, and came across the fact that the state law department, the Florida Department of Health, uniquely goes into a significant amount of regulatory authority over the operations of RV parks, with just about every other use, similar use or type of use we would get into are things that we set, the state doesn't set. Here, the Department of Health does get involved with those, and these include, the density, the setback from the edge of the property line, sewer hookups, the space between the units, the spaces for the RV parks. The state of Florida, the Department of Health really regulates those pretty thoroughly. And when you read it, it talks about the state and the city will agree on these things. But then later in that same statute, it uses the word preemption, about they preempt us. So Brian and I talked. Brian talked to the state, and I think what Brian just told me is he was initially told, oh, we have authority. We could set, the state sets the baseline, is what the state said. We can be more restrictive. And I guess the state rescinded, called you back and said, well, no, we regulate it. You can't regulate. So based on that, I don't think we have a lot of authority here in terms of things that we would normally regulate. Like when you start talking about units per acre and setbacks and those type of issues, it doesn't sound like we really have the authority to regulate those, because that's set by state law. Where our regulatory authority may come into play possibly is access points on the road.
Utilities.
Some, but they do hookups. They talk about hookups and stuff, so they do quite a bit there, but possibly amenities, possibly landscaping.
But then other structures, if they would have like a clubhouse on the
That's on
property,
the amenities, yeah.
we would be able to regulate that.
We would be able to regulate that, but it's not what we're normally used to with a regulatory authority. Like when we sit down with a PUD, we would go through and say, okay, here are all your densities, units per acre, and your setbacks, and all these things. It wouldn't have that. So I'm not even sure a PUD would really be an appropriate thing, because so much of it would be based on what state law is, as opposed to what we would, traditionally negotiate with the property owner, developer. But that's, for discussion.
So the initial thought was, this is a great idea. We were really plugging forward. And then after the last week or so, when we started talking about what we have the ability to regulate or not, it gave me a little pause for concern that if we don't have the ability to regulate or create a PUD, we may know what Robin has in mind with his thoughts and ideas for building an RV park. But here's a scenario of Robin gets it entitled and then sells it, and somebody else wants to come in and develop it. Well, now I don't know who may be coming in, and now I have no control or authority over it, and that raises a bit of a concern for me. So not a great deal, but, you know, the last thing I would want to see is an RV park that mimics one of the poor-looking trailer parks that we have in the city. We don't want that. We have a couple of nice trailer parks, but we have a couple of poor trailer parks. And, you know, the RV park is supposed to represent more of an upscale recreational area where they are, you know, everything from the low end of, you know, $20,000 units to several $100,000 RVs coming in and spending time here in the city. So with that, I think I might want to ask Mark to come up and give us his interpretation or understanding of what we may or may not.
And before we go, Mark, Vice Mayor had a question,
Scott,
and then we'll hear from you.
my experience with camping is that there's many campgrounds that put strict regulations on who can come and go.
Are those state or
They're in the state of Florida, so I would.
state parks? You have state
No,
park.
I'm talking about private parks. Some places won't let you in if you're over 10 years old.
But that's the owner's decision, right? It's not the city's decision?
I would imagine you're right.
Okay.
The owner of the park?
Yeah.
Well, the areas that I think in this one statute clearly jump out as things that I think we have difficulty regulating are lot size, lots density, separation, and setback. Those are the situations that jumped out, which traditionally cities would be able to. The other thing I think y'all should discuss is how long will people be allowed to stay there? And there's I think you should anticipate, some people will live there unless we figure out a way to stop
I
it.
don't think you would want them living there.
Well, again,
Well, but I'm
that's
just
not
saying-
something that we can regulate.
Historically, I mean, I know somebody who has an RV park in Volusia County. And year-round, there's 20-30% occupied. The vast majority of that is permanent residents. Obviously, then you go beyond that, you have your special events where it gets high, a lot of people. If people stay there, I think it's 150 days, maybe it's 6 months, but there's a period of time that they are treated as hotel guests, where they can call the police and the police will remove them from the park. Once you go past that date, you get into landlord-tenant and they have to be evicted. So there's a cutoff date where that the police will be involved in removing people who violate the rules or whatever the case may be. But beyond that date, the law views that as more of a residential tenancy and they will have to be evicted. So that's one area of discussion.
Well, another question then that I have is, when we make this zoning, at what point does it become residential if someone does end up staying there? We don't have rules and we can't do that. Maybe Brian, could you answer that? Shaking your head.
We don't know what that date, that time frame is. It could be 6 months. We run into the same situation with our motels.
Yeah.
These motels on Ridgewood Avenue are supposed to be transient. Somebody's supposed to come
Mark,
in.
if you want to sit down, I'll call you back up. Sorry, I don't want you to stand the whole time.
It's supposed to be transient. People come in, they stay a day, they stay a week, they stay a month. They're supposed to leave. They end up staying a longer period of time, and then the motel owner, when there's a problem, has a hard time evicting them because that is their permanent residence.
Wow.
And then you have to go through a more formal eviction process, as opposed to you rent it. You're more familiar. You go to a hotel, you rent it for the weekend, you're in and you're gone. Mm-hmm. You have other hotels and motels that are long-term stays where you can rent it for a year. But then you get some people that stay indefinitely. And that's where law enforcement runs into a problem when the property owner comes in and says, this is a bad tenant, he's doing drugs, he's bringing people we don't like, whatever, you need to get him out. And the police turn around and go, well, this is their residence, they've been here for 8 months. We can't kick them out. It's now your job to go through the eviction process.
And now is that property owner in violation of something with the city because now they've allowed residential in a non-residential area like a motel?
It's a
Because-
fine line.
The cutoff is 6 months. I just looked it up. It's that's the definition of transience, is 6 months or less. Over 6 months, there's a rebuttable presumption that the occupancy is non-transient and the eviction procedures apply.
Can we ban?
But it'll be no different than right now. I mean, couldn't we say that about our hotels? These are commercial properties. It's not residential.
Right.
We got people living there.
Right.
Joe just talked about it.
And that's,
So, how, that's whether we could get into regulating that, I'm not sure. Do we? I don't
no,
think so.
not right now.
Yeah,
Right.
so, and a lot of the hotels and then the RV parks are regulated by the state agencies. Their operation and use is regulated by the state agency. And this is the Department of Health that regulates this. I don't know, I guess it's the Hotel Motel Restaurant Association or something like that.
Division of Hotel and Restaurants.
Yeah, that would regulate the hotels, but this regulation's by the Department of Health. Then there's another provision, just scrolling through the statutes I pulled down. All sanitary sewer, everything related to the sanitary of a
That's the health department.
RV park, exclusive jurisdiction of the health department. We don't,
Well, that should be.
which is fine, it makes it easy for us. We don't have to
Maybe.
look at it, maybe, yeah.
But the
Well, it
other
makes it
stuff-
easy.
the
We
other
just may not
stuff,
be
no.
happy. So,
So the question in my head is, since we're kind of handcuffed, can we ban, let's say, trailers from being there? Because that, in my picture, would be residential, and we're not going for a residential classification.
You have to define what a trailer is.
like a mobile home.
Like a mobile home, yeah.
There's a lot of park models in campgrounds that you would call a trailer.
So what?
It's called a park model. It's a manufactured home that comes in either on a flatbed or on wheels, and they park it there.
Oh, and they rent them out?
It's like a motel room.
There's a lot of state regulation over mobile home, modular home, and what the cities can do with that. And mobile homes are mobile. They're built to different standards. They're actually built to HUD standards, the Federal Housing Authority standards, and not to the Florida Building Code standards.
Yeah, the building official has no authority inside of a mobile.
Yeah,
Mobile home.
it's,
They actually get a sticker, a Department of Transportation decal for their
Mm-hmm.
units.
Interesting.
and that line's getting a little blurrier as, you get some modular homes look like mobile homes and get mobile homes that may look more like modular homes. And a lot of mobile homes start out mobile, but then they aren't after a while. They're realistically not. There's just a lot of questions. Obviously, the property owner has much more authority than we do over what he allows on that park. So, looking at the covenants and restrictions that they place on the operations there would be very helpful. But can we say you have to put those in your regulations, or before you modify your regulations, we have to approve them? Because they could put it in, get the approval, then someone else comes along, like Joe has indicated, buys the park, and modifies all the regulations. So,
But Joe sent us out a lot of the state regulations, and someone had highlighted a bunch of dates.
That was
Stuff
me.
Scott had.
And it didn't look that terrible. It's not like they're having a slaughterhouse there. It wasn't.
No.
The regulations weren't that egregious that are controlled by the state. So I don't want us to think that, we have no control. The state, I think the important thing is let's look at what the level of control the state applies to these parks and see if we can live with that. Because if they say you can have 300 units per acre, well, that's probably too much.
Well, there's two things, Commissioner. One is like you said, how much control does the state actually have? The other level of concern that I have is how much control does the state have that they do or do not enforce? Because they're technically responsible for the enforcement of all of these other trailer parks in the city that they are not enforcing.
Right.
Okay? So it's both sides of that.
I get you. I hear you.
concern.
I think, I remember reading somewhere, Brian, is it in information that talks about the lot size, the unit size, the density per acre? Is that in the administrative code?
That's in the administrative code.
Yeah, so that, was that
Yeah,
provided?
I saw in the packet, it talked about density, but now I'm hearing we can't regulate density.
But
So
that's coming from
the
state.
No, it was the state density.
Okay,
It's state density.
all right.
I can't pull it up on my
And,
phone.
yeah, I can't either. That's why we
Hack
need those
computers.
computers. So, but what I'm hearing though is, so we have if we go down the path of making a zoning and just allowing it to happen, then it just goes back to the state of whatever they want to do. I think the goal of this commission, I could be wrong, but what I think, or what my vision is to have an upscale type RV park. And to do that, you need amenities. And we can actually regulate those amenities, correct, by saying the building and let's say a lazy river pool.
Not the size or the location of, like, the lazy river. The building by building code, but the other amenities, whether it's a pond or a lazy river or a pool, that we would not.
What if they were put in, so what if we did a PUD and,
Can't do a PUD.
even though we could regulate those amenities? Yeah, Brian. Or at least, what I'm saying is make that the standard. We know that that's going in. Then we think that there's going to be an upscale RV park around it, and then that just is regulated by the state, the RV part. I guess I'm wrong.
Well, what happens initially is that a site plan is done, and that site plan is submitted to the state. The state reviews everything that is on that plan. Even you addressed earlier, what if someone wanted to put in trailers? There can be spaces where people have, or where it's delineated that they have trailers, but sometimes if you only have a few trailers, the overall standard that would be required would be as if they were an RV, RVs. But everything that's on there is reviewed by the state. So the state told me we wouldn't be able to regulate a pool. If they wanted to put in a pool, that's something that they would submit. It would get reviewed by the state. If they wanted to do a clubhouse, where it gets put, how it's placed, orientation, all of that is something that they would look at. That's not to say that at the beginning of the process, we would have no input, because the statutes do say that in conjunction with the local jurisdiction, some of these things would be decided. But then, as the city attorney stated, later on, it seems to take that away by saying everything is preempted to the state. So, and some things are addressed in the administrative code, other things are addressed in this Florida statutes, but the administrative code tells you your density, tells you how big the lot sizes have to be, the setbacks from the property line, all of those things are regulated by the state. So, really, one of the questions that we have is, do we want to have an RV park there? And if the answer is yes, then we get what we get in terms of what's approved by the state. And while Mr. Hangers may be very nice and upscale, again, as the city manager said, if he ever sells, that's not to say that somebody may not go back to the minimums.
Right. All right. And at this time, unless there's a further question, we'll go ahead and bring the applicant up. Are you the applicant?
I'm not the applicant, I'm the engineer who's assisting him.
Okay, just, and state your name, who you're with for the record, please.
My name is, Mr. Mayor, members of the commission, Joe, Scott. My name is Mark Doust. I'm a project engineer with Mark Doust and Associates. We're located at 536 North Halifax. And I think I'm asked to be here because we have a lot of experience doing RV parks, permitting them in various jurisdictions. And so I think we've come up with a lot of these questions before and can kind of tell you how other people have addressed them. So
Perfect.
I'm not an attorney, I'm not a planner, but I work in all those arenas, so I have a working knowledge. First of all, most places do have zoning that sets forth that use. So the fact that you don't is kind of a different situation, and I agree you'd have to create that use in order to have it in your code. Most places that do allow it have certain districts for mobile homes, and they have different classifications, and then they have maybe another district for RVs. So it's distinctly different. They don't typically throw them in the same, but they can. Mobile homes are thought about as being residential. RVs are considered typically as non-residential, so they're treated differently. So the density isn't the same. They're typically, the way we get them approved these days is going to get mobile home zoning is, even though it's in the books in many ordinance in many cities, Typically, they don't like to zone it straight zoning any longer. Typically, they use the PUD process. So, I mean, within the last 6 months, we completed 2 PUDs in unincorporated Volusia County. Both of those were for RV parks. And both of those are for, fairly upscale parks. But I will tell you that in the base regulation that they have in their code, which for Volusia County would be like MH2, they call it mobile home park and recreational vehicle park, that's what they call it. In there, they actually have all the space sizes, separations, there's a bunch of criteria, perimeter setbacks, and I bet if we compared those, Scott, with what you found in the codes, we would probably find a lot of similarities to those. Now, I will tell you that many times we don't adhere to those. Many times we're larger because it depends on the objective of the park and what you're trying. Yes, sir.
Just, would it be fair to say that, from what I understand, the state regulates this, but you said that a PUD has been applied. Would it be fair to say that the PUD is less restrictive than the state requirements?
Well,
So like if the state says a site's going to be 20 by 40,
yeah,
then the PUD is going to say it's going to be 30 by 50.
it could.
It couldn't be less than that though, right?
No, it could be less than the state.
Okay.
And typically, there isn't very many projects we do that don't have overlapping jurisdiction. We did Florida Hospital, but yet ACA was in charge of everything to do with the hospital. We do restaurants, but then you have the division that regulates restaurants and kitchens and all that kind of stuff. So all of those projects typically got rezoned, they typically got a site plan, they typically got a lot of regulation by the city, but there's the other regulations that apply as well, and the project has to meet all of them. So I mentioned that even though cities have straight zoning that allow RVs, in today's age, when I'm going for RVs, typically they don't allow us to simply rezone to an RV designation. Typically, they like to use the PUD process. They like to see it. They like to see the layout, where they're all placed. And based upon the review of that, then they decide whether or not they would issue that PUD zoning. And typically, it's not a residential PUD, it's a business PUD, because they consider it non-residential. They typically also place in there the 6-month restriction that you can't have or occupy a particular site for more than 6 months. And I think some of the fears that I've heard just about everything over the last 40 years, is that, they don't want an RV that someone builds a carport on and then a back room, and next thing you know, the school bus shows up. That's the fear. So I think that's one of the reasons why the 6 month is in there. It also makes it a transient thing, subject to resort tax and things like that. That might be another reason. Most of the performas don't work with long-term anyway. They're designed to get their revenue through short-term type things. They try and cater to the higher-end RVers. They want services. They want attractive sites. They don't want just shell and a couple of trees. They want full hookups. They want cable. They want a clubhouse. They want a pool, and they want easy check-in. And if you do all those things right, you will have a customer that's willing to pay a good rate for a night. And as was alluded to before, mobile homes have changed a lot. So what we did 30 years ago is a lot different now. Some of the rigs are several hundred thousands of dollars. They have slide outs, and the sites have changed to accommodate all those things. So I even saw a park over by Marco Island, and they were selling the sites for like $500,000 each. I mean, huge sites, all paved, and they build a little house that goes on it, and that's what people are paying for in some areas. The idea of an RV is, you used to think, well, it's kind of a cheap way to travel, but honestly, it doesn't have to be. I mean, they can buy an RV that's very high-end, and they put all their comforts of home in there, and when they travel, they're not moving in and out, carrying all this stuff in and out. They can carry all this stuff with them, go to a site, and it's become a very attractive mode of vacationing. Lately, it has exploded because the whole idea of COVID and controlling your space and all that stuff has just added so much to it. So you can't, if you go to try and buy an RV, you'll find there's a pretty good waiting list, and all the prices have gone up. And I think it's helped them catch a lot more attention. We did an RV park in Daytona Beach just recently, went through the zoning process. That was also a PUD. So, and I can show you the example layout so you can kind of see what goes into these things. Now, you touched on park models. Someone touched on park models. Park models is another concept. They used to have them that were just basic. You had a room, maybe a kitchen and something like that, and it was on a site. And if you pulled up your RV, you could spread out a little bit. And if you bought your site, you could keep things in this permanent park model. We don't see that as much as we used to, but what we do see is we see dedicated park models. So you may have a site that's set up for an RV, you may have a whole bunch of those, but then you may have sites that already have what we call a park model on them. Park model are typically regulated by HUD or ANSI, depending upon who puts it together. They're typically regulated to be either 300 or 400 square feet. They have a limitation, so there's a lot of regulations on the actual unit. It is pre-manufactured, delivered to a site. It has wheels, but typically they're set up and they put skirting around it and landscaping so that for all practical purposes, they're just like a permanent mobile home. They're not intended for permanent residency. They're intended for transient. So typically, that's where the 6 months comes in on those too, even they look like a permanent home. I'll give you an idea of just some of the ones that were in this. If I brought those. Just to give you a feel for those.
Hey, Val, could you pull up page 17 in the packet, please?
These are just sample park models, and these exhibits here were used in the rezoning for Jungle Den, which is the one we are completing over there in the county. It'll give you an idea. So someone could have a park model, because what's happening is people not
little bit
everybody
down.
owns an RV.
That's good.
And so sometimes what they do is they travel, and then friends say, well, can we come too? Well, they don't have an RV, they'd have to rent one, so many times they'll come with them. They rent a park model if they're set up on the same place. That's a park model. Yeah. So those things cost maybe $60,000 to $70,000 depending upon what's in them. They're pretty small, so the cost isn't that great. But when you look at them, they're pretty amazing what they do with their space and so forth.
Tiny house.
Pretty well designed.
But that still comes under the regulation of an RV?
It does. They're, by definition, if you go into the Florida statutes, they call them RVs. I mean, yes, RVs.
So it still comes under the Department of Health regulations?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I believe it does.
My suggestion to staff as to why to have this meeting was in part so if possibly if Mr. Hanger could tell us what his vision is for that site. Are we to that point yet?
Well, we were just retained last week.
Well, maybe not you. Is he to that point yet?
Possibly.
Just an idea. I mean, how much has he looked into it? How many units per acre? I think looking at state law, they have to be the spaces have to be a minimum of 1,200 square feet. The density can't exceed 25 recreational vehicle units per gross acre. Tent spaces shall be a minimum of 500 square feet. Is he looking is he looking for 25 units per 25 recreational sites per acre? What's the unit size? Is he going to think of having tents? Is he thinking about having these
Well,
permanent things?
Mark, before you change the thought, these park models, are those modular that are brought in, or are they built in place?
No, they're modular.
Okay.
They're modular and, just give you an idea of how the county regulations, now you mentioned 1,200 square feet.
That's under the Florida Administrative Code.
So if I pulled out like Volusia County and I pulled out their straight classification and you put it under there, they would say minimum project size 10 acres, minimum space size 1,500 square feet. So they regulate a minimum of 15, they won't approve it if they aren't. So that's a little bit bigger than what that
So
minimum.
that would be consistent with when Brian called and talked to the Department of Health, he was initially told state law set the minimum threshold, local jurisdictions can be more restrictive. And then the person called back and said, wait a minute, what I told you was not correct. We regulate these things, you don't. So your understanding is it's the latter or the earlier one where it says it's a a minimum threshold that they set the base regulation, and your experience is that we can be more restrictive,
Well,
not
that's,
less restrictive.
that's how Daytona Beach operates, and that's how Volusia County operates. And then when we come up with a design, many times they're bigger, because sometimes we do like double sites, or sometimes we do what's called a luxury site. They may have other things on there.
Have you had a situation where the developer wanted to build to the minimums of the state law, and the local jurisdiction said, no, our minimums are greater, and did you ever get in? I think it's a minimum, so you can always do bigger.
I have not, because typically we've always gone into the codes that the jurisdiction had and followed those. Okay, if they were more, that's what we did. And then when we didn't have specific codes, because some places don't have specific regulations, we typically end up following something like Volusia. And again, a lot of our designs, depending upon what we're trying to achieve, have larger things anyway. So,
Because if a local jurisdiction says it's got to be 1,500 square feet, well, then it meets the minimum of 1,200, but the issue would be if a developer came in and said, I want some 1,200, I don't want to comply with your 1,500 square feet. That could be an issue,
But-
or,
that hasn't happened to me,
Hasn't
but,
happened.
but I would say that if, let's say someone came to you with a proposal for a non-residential PUD for RV parks, you would see it all. So you would see minimum space size. You can have as much or as little detail as you want, and meeting that criteria would be a requirement to gaining your votes and your support for the zoning. So the interesting part that you brought up, which is that they could preempt what the local people said, that's interesting, and I'd love to get a copy of what you've highlighted so I can take a look at it. I probably haven't looked at it in a while.
Vice Mayor has a question over here.
It's just, my experience, I guess I'm the only one up here that has an RV, is that I've been to RV parks that you can obviously tell were built to the state minimum standards, and they're probably 30 years old. When people used to pull around a 16-foot Airstream with their, 1962 Chevelle or whatever. And RVs have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't know how old those standards are, but I don't think you'd find any. I've never been to a site. Well, I lie. I've been to a place in Winter Garden that was so tight that you had to back up 72 times to get into your spot, because it's probably built to the state standards in 1950. But these sites are huge now, because these people are driving $1, $2, $3 million buses that are 65 feet long, pulling a 40-foot trailer behind it with their Corvette or their Bentley or whatever. And I mean, there's $1 million rolling down the road here, and they're not going to squeeze into some little.
well, these are minimum, 1,200.
Yeah,
No, that's what I mean. I don't think anyone would, in their right mind, would build it to that minimum standard, because you couldn't get you could get my RV in there, but you couldn't get a Prevost or something in there.
maybe I'm not envisioning this
Yeah.
correctly, though, but 1,200 square feet sounds like a lot of space to me. Is that not a lot of space?
It'd be like 20
Or-
by 60, and once you hooked up your 30-foot camper to your 20-foot truck, there's not much more room there.
Oh, wow.
So when we go 30, 35 feet wide on a site, it really, it gives us, the place where the RV goes.
And
It gives
picnic
us
table.
room for the-
And they have slide outs now.
Yeah, yeah.
The
Slide
slide out
out.
Oh,
goes
that's
6 or
true.
8 feet out the side, so
That's true.
you're 8 feet wide, now you're 16 feet wide, and some of these things have slides on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
20
It's
feet
not
wide.
Tomoka State Park.
And then you kind of,
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of,
Yeah, I know
because
you
that's
are.
where I've been,
I
yeah.
know.
and then you want a patio. Most of them want a patio,
Right.
so they can set up outside.
The only cap is the 25 units. That's no more 25 spaces per acre. That seems
Is that net?
gross.
Gross.
Gross site.
How many
Per
acres
acre
is the
of gross
property
site.
that you're looking to purchase?
That
Total.
takes into account even
About 25
wetlands,
acres.
retention, all that stuff.
Yeah, so what happens is, obviously, you have retention and all that, and this site happens to be in the floodplain, so there's some compensating flood storage, so it's going to have more water than your normal site, okay? But by the time you lay in all the things you want, normally, you're not hitting that density cap,
Well, what
It's
kind
got-
of spaces are you looking for? Do you have a density and idea, Robin?
You can come up, Mr. Hanger.
I think
One unit?
what Robin is.
One big one.
What Robin has asked us to do is to take a look at the site, see what it can hold, see what a good design looks like on that, okay? And since we got retained last week, we haven't got that. We're just collecting all the surveys from all the different sources from old stuff. But eventually, we will have a plan that we can show you, and you can look at it. And not only will it show what the site plan looks like, it'll have like a blow-up of a typical site too, so you can see how everything arranges. I did bring examples of those typical kinds of sites that we've done for other projects to give you an idea if you want to look at those too.
Okay.
So are we doing a comp plan amendment and a rezoning?
Based on what I'm hearing, if they're considered a business use, then we could probably do a DPUD, which would eliminate having to create a zoning district.
So our original thought of pushing it under the mobile home,
That
we wouldn't have to do that.
We would do a BPUD. The only thing I would need to look at is whether or not we have any, I don't have a comprehensive plan designation for it. So we may have to do a text amendment to allow that. And what we would do is incorporate the state minimums.
Brian, can you come to the mic just to get all those? I don't mind an answer or two. Thank you, Mr. Penny. I don't mind an answer, one or two, but that's pretty substantial information you're saying.
Yeah, if most of them are done as business plan unit developments, we have a category for that. So we wouldn't need to create a zoning district. We would simply take our BPUD and then we would structure the plan within that criteria. We don't have, however, anything that sets density standards for recreational vehicle parks. We don't have a future land use designation for that. None of the residential ones would fit, and the business ones all address things like your FAR or your floor area ratios and things of that matter. So we don't have anything that addresses recreational vehicle, but we can do it. We can do a text amendment to the comprehensive plan. That would also be reviewed by the state, so you're still looking at a few months to do that.
What about other things like landscaping requirements and, because there is no, we don't have any standards.
The state, as the city attorneys accurately stated, when I talked to the state, one of the fellows that I talked to was Eric. I don't have his last name, but his name was Eric. He does for Volusia County a lot of the inspections, and he deals with the State Department of Health, Volusia County Department of Health. He mentioned to me initially, he said, we set the minimums, and if you want to go beyond that, if you want to also have some landscaping standards and you want to have things that go above and beyond what we have, you can do that. Then he called me back and he said, I misspoke, and he had talked to his bosses in Tallahassee, which I actually spoke with his supervisor in Tallahassee. He's local, and he said to me, you don't have the
Authority.
leeway that you thought, that I thought you did. He said, a lot of jurisdictions do it, but
So who would
don't have
possibly complain? Who would?
But if,
The owner?
but if we don't have the jurisdiction to do it, if the owner agrees to do it, we're not forcing them to do it, and they could agree to a greater restriction than the state minimum requirements at the
It's back to
PUD.
my concern of being, the city being a regulatory authority that's regulating something we don't have, may not have the right to regulate. So even though the current applicant wants to play along and says, "You're right, I'll let you put in regulations that are more strict than the state," I just get a little concerned that we're regulating
No,
something.
I do too, but if you've applied the PUD zoning, then you know exactly what it is, even if you sell it 6 times.
Yeah, but I think what Joe is saying is that we agree with Mr. Hanger, he agrees, say, okay, these are our regulations. Then he sells it, and that person sells, and then somebody comes in and says, I want to amend the PUD and I want to do this. And
Go to the state standard, the state level.
yeah, do whatever it is, and say hypothetically, we say, look, you're not going to have more than 15 units, and they're going to be a minimum of 1,500 square feet sites. and he comes back and says, I want a minimum, whoever the new owner is, says, I want a minimum, I want to amend it, I want to have 1,200, and I want to have 25 units per acre, and we say, no, we're not approve that. He comes back and says, you can't deny it because the state preempts you, I'm complying with state law.
Yeah, but.
The dialogue that goes.
But if we did it through a BPUD and we did it that way, and then let's say he sells it, now somebody comes in, they want to change it down to the minimums, we don't have classification on that property, zoning for them to fall back on. So we say, you know what, can we withdraw that BUPD at that time?
Probably not. No, the problem
There's-
is.
you can't
the
get out
land
of a
use-
PD?
We're going to set some land use standards, and then, anytime amending anything dealing with comp plan, we have discretion on. But once we start dealing with zoning, we don't. And we have to have substantial competent evidence. And my concern is if somebody, one down the road came back and said, the agreement violates state law, it's void. It's not valid. Your development agreement's not valid because you have restrictions in here, and previous owner agreed to it, that's fine, but I'm not bound by it because you have regulations in here that violated state law at the time. So we're going to come back and invalidate that, and we're just going to go with state law.
Well, that's what I'm saying, but if we don't create a classification for it, and if it's done through the BPUD, do we have to create a classification is what I'm saying of now we come up with RV, or can we just do it through the BUPD? And let's say they come back and they say, no, we want to do it way less to state standards. Now that's void anyways. We go, you know what, this PUD is not even there. We don't have a classification
Well,
for RVs anyways.
Well, we do. When Brian refers to classification, that's land use. So to
Okay.
allow Mr. Hanger to go forward,
Have
we're
to
going
make
to
a
have
land
to
use
create
change.
that land use and put it on the property.
Okay.
I think the overall concern is, and it may not be something that's likely to occur, but just, worst case scenario type thing is, we open the door up for an RV park. And we think we have these regulations in place, but the state trumps us. But we can't close the door now. We've opened it,
Okay.
they're in, the state comes in and overrules everything we have. You have the ability, city, to say yes or no, but how, we say.
Because of the land use. That makes
We
sense.
set the land use, we open it up, we get them in there, they get in there pursuant to our blessing, and then because of the preemption at the state says, no, they're allowed to do they can make these changes because that's still consistent with our law, and we preempt you, city.
Right.
But we've already allowed you in there. So that's a concern, and I'm not saying that from, a very, a significant concern that we would say, oh, we can never think about doing this, but I think we have to advise you on what is worst-case scenario. You gotta, and this is unique, and to me, it's unique in that I understand hospitals and the buildings, they have federal license and stuff, but I'm thinking of like condo developments and residential subdivision developments. We control so much of what occurs on those sites through our own regulation. We control units per acre, we control minimum lot size, front yard, side yard, rear yard setback, how much coverage and open space. We regulate all that stuff. We can't do it with this. That's the unique thing to me. So, you just need to be aware. And I think we're feeling our way through it. And I think having Mark help the applicant is going to help us. He's been involved before. Maybe the Eric that Brian talked to will come back with a third opinion. We've gotten two, so maybe he'll come back with a third one somewhere in between.
We're going to
But-
request an opinion in writing. at
Yeah.
some point rather than just.
Mr. Mayor.
But it is unique. So.
Vice Mayor?
No, and I appreciate Mr. Forte bringing it, to the forefront. I think the worst-case scenario is we have 25 acres, no one wants to see 625 RVs at Bishop's property. But I think we might be putting the cart a little before the horse because Mr. Dow said he was just retained 2 weeks ago.
Last week.
He's going to come back in the next 60 days, and he's going to say, okay, St. John's needs this, floodplain needs this. Now out of the 25 acres, we really only have 17 buildable acres.
Well, no, it
and
doesn't, that's why I asked before, it doesn't go by net buildable acres, it's gross.
It's gross,
It's gross, so that's.
625.
yeah.
The reason why we're doing this is, Robin, as the potential buyer, has a due diligence time period. And we wanted to get the commission's, we want to bring this to your attention, get your input, get some direction from you to see how we're going to move forward, because we have to try to do all this, everything from the land use change to the zoning, to the design and the engineering, all within this 150-day time period. Now, hopefully, he can get an extension if he needs to, but there's a critical time frame that we have to come in compliance with.
No, and
Right.
based on my experience with these parks, I would be greatly surprised if you got anywhere close to 200 spots on that 25-acre parcel. Just because there's roads, there's lakes, there's bathhouses and pools and all that kind of, I don't know, I'd be surprised. I
Well,
don't think it's gonna get anywhere close to what.
a lot of this is a lot of the legal aspect of it, which I know I have confidence that you guys will drill that down by the next workshop. So at this time, Mr. Hanger, if you'd like to come up and give us the vision of what you're looking for, if you don't want to, that's okay, but if you could tell us the vision of what you're looking for, and that way we could see that. And for the record,
Robin Hanger, 950 Ridgewood Avenue. Well, I've gotten where I am today by having people that know more than I do, and obviously Mark has been hired to look into this. The size of the sites, all this still comes back to what he finds out, but my vision of it is that the size of the actual pad where the RV goes will be between 30 and 35 feet. Then you're going to have 8 to 10 feet of xeriscape in between the next pad. And 14 feet is as wide as an RV can get when it's all opened up because of the way the slides work. But, there are slides, some with 4 and 5 slides on them, but still at 14 feet, if you did a 35 feet, you have enough room to pull the vehicle. Most of the RVs are either pulled by a vehicle or they tow a vehicle behind them so the wife can get to the grocery store or wherever.
So go to the grocery store too.
Yeah, well, some do. So that goes beside them, and then they have still room in front, the length of the RV, for their awning to open up. So on the concrete pad, or whatever foundation pad you put there, whether it be pavers or concrete, whatever, that is their living area. That is their house. They bring everything with them. Buying the RV is the cheap part, actually. It's filling it up. So the vision is to have that. All the sites are pretty much going to be the same length. There'll be a couple. There'll be a few. I would say 10 maybe that will be longer to accommodate these 100-foot vehicles that are being pulled. There are people that buy them. 75 feet is the max, but I've sold numerous trailers myself to people with these RVs that are 100 foot, and they just keep the checkbook on the dash to pay the fine. They don't care. So I will have sites, and there's people that want those and can't get them, so I'll have some sites that are available for that. Another initial thing is a clubhouse with, good size, a very good size pool and lazy river. The retention ponds that are going to be there, whether it be one or one with connected to multiple to be the same, volume. It's going to be an upscale park. I don't know if, any of you want to look up a place called Renegades. That is, I won't say a model, but it's real close to a model. I would like to think that ours will even be better than that, because it's got golf next to it. So I've got to create something that a golfer person's going to want to go to the pickleball people are going to want to go to the millennials are going to want to come to. So as far as long-term, there won't be any long-term there. There's, the 6-month rule is on that, and I intend on possibly even shortening that up so that I have some leeway for a person that may give you a little bit of a problem and not moving out on that 6 month in one day, and then they go, oh, well, I'm still here. So, all that comes from I've got a lawyer that's working on that, and all that'll come about. So that's, as far as landscaping, it's going to be landscaped as much as possible, but also to be able to accommodate RVs to get in and out and around. A lot of xeriscape and and lighting and, stuff like that, so. Any
Great.
questions?
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Hanger. Another thing you might want to think about too, since we're a golf cart community as well, is, I don't even know if this is possible, but a rental thing of golf carts, and if we... Of course. But I was thinking about it, and, I would imagine a lot of people for the tournaments to stay there for pickleball, and they'd have to go down, I believe, they'd have to go down Center Street, right?
Yeah, we would, in that scenario, we would probably do a shuttle system where pickleball or somebody would rent a shuttle to actually move these people back and forth rather than multiple golf carts.
Yeah, because it would be nice once they're here to have them mobile so they can visit our restaurants and any shops that we may have, so. All right, well, Joe, first, are there any further questions? So I believe it's the will of this commission, without objection, to move forward, continue to I would say, get the response back in writing from the state, and continue down this process to bring it back to us when we have more information. Is there any more action that you would want from us?
No, this is more educational for all of us, really, and then just to see if there's objection from the commission as to whether or not we move forward. If you turned around and you said, too much risk, I don't want to do it, we tell Robin, let's stop here, and
Right.
that'd be the end of it. But
I'm certainly not signing off on it now. I don't think anyone is, but we definitely are moving forward. Yeah.
What I would, right now, preliminarily envision is similar process we did with Marina Grand. We brought a package of documents. We won't have to do quite as much, but we will be bringing forward, I anticipate, an amendment to the comprehensive plan to create the land use. And that'd be by ordinance, then another ordinance applying that land use to this property, and then rezoning the property to BPUD. There will have to be staggered effective dates, because,
some of this is going to the VOPA.
yeah, some of the, or all of it, I think. Well, but it would have to go for a recommendation, 2 readings here, but they would have delayed effective dates, because you can't apply land use, we can't rezone until the land use is in place, and you can't apply the land use until you actually create it. So we adopt the ordinance creating it, we also adopt the ordinance applying it, but that doesn't become effective until the ordinance creating it becomes effective. And then the rezoning ordinance doesn't become effective until the land use, applying the land use to the property becomes effective. So, but it will all be approved in one meeting, is what I envision. That's what we did with Marina Grand. But it will, through the effective dates, it will be kind of a domino effective date, because one has to occur before the next. But to bring these all at separate times would take even more time. So that's why we need to kind of get it all condensed down to bring you a package. So at one time. So that's what we did with Marina Grand. It seemed to work, and that's what we're going to do. Plan. And that's what, in my mind anyway, that's what we'll do here. But that's ultimately not my decision. But
Does that sound good, Mr. Forte?
Say that again?
Does that sound good, Mr. Forte?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's
Vice Mayor?
what we're doing.
And one other thing, we may have Brian reach out to Mr. Douse, since he's got a couple of these projects going. Jungle Den is Astor? Yes. Astor? That's going to be phenomenal over there. And so since we don't have a regulation, we might, instead of reinventing the whole wheel, let's look at what these other municipalities
I
have
agree.
done
Yeah.
with the current standards, and then they're going to be far greater than the minimum state standards. Because we could sit here and arbitrarily say, oh, it needs to be, the state said it's 12, well, we want 14. Well, why did they do it at 16 in Jungle Den, and this and that? Because there's reasons, I'm sure, Joe, you're the only one that's probably ever driven a fire truck, but that's probably the closest thing to driving one of these RVs, is you got to get the fire truck around that corner to make it, and that's what these big rigs have to do. So I'm sure other people have considered that.
Is that one in Astor, is that technically unincorporated?
It is, it's in the unincorporated area.
So you're dealing with county planning on that one? So we can communicate with them as well and kind of get their input and see how they're dealing with it.
And what's the one in Daytona you're doing?
That's the Daytona Beach RV Resort. That's where I-4 and 92 come together.
Oh, that huge piece of land.
Robin wants to say
You wanted to add something before we end?
Robin Hanger, 950 Ridgewood Avenue again. Joe, there is, not that it matters a whole lot. I mean, but there is a time frame. It's-
Oh, I know there's a time frame.
Yeah, I mean, you said we may be able to get an extension. I doubt that.
I'm figuring you have 150 days from your contract date.
From the 29th of last month, I got
Yeah,
150
which
days.
is why we had this meeting tonight, so.
Yeah,
so
right.
we've got a very tight,
I understand. I just let you know there is a time frame on it, and that's why, like he said, Scott said, bringing everything to you at one time is what Brian or what Mark will be able to do too, and so it has to go forward by then. So I just want to let you know there was 150 days.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hanger. Is there anything to add before we end this workshop? All right, we'll go ahead and end this workshop, and we will reconvene in about 10 minutes to start the City Commission meeting. 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 City Commission meeting.